The millionaire CEO mocked the janitor until her invention saved the company, and what the board did shocked everyone. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Gentlemen, Straton Technology could go bankrupt in a matter of months. Robert King's voice was deep, filled with tension. His words hit the room like a bomb. A murmur spread among the 10 board members. Eyes met in shock. Robert stood up, adjusted his suit, and projected a harsh chart onto the screen. A red line dropping sharply. "These numbers," he said, keeping his voice steady, "show our last 6 months of operations. Revenue dropped 48%. Expenses went up by 30%. The old contracts are expiring and the new ones," he paused bitterly, "just aren't coming." One of the board members, a gray-haired, tense man, tapped his pen on the table. "How did this happen, Robert? We're a leading tech company. Just 3 years ago, we were dominating the automation market." Robert pressed his lips before answering. "We stopped moving forward. Our main software is outdated. The management system we use was developed 8 years ago and has never really been updated. We're losing clients because Straton's product has become obsolete." Another board member raised his voice. "Then update the system. Hire new developers." "I tried," Robert replied, now more sharply. "But payroll is bloated, the innovation budget was cut, and every update takes months to get approved by you." His words echoed off the glass walls. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Outside, Sophie Hayes was pushing her cleaning cart. The wheels squeaked softly across the polished floor. She approached the meeting room, where the voices were getting louder. A sign on the door read, "Board meeting, do not disturb." But no one noticed when she quietly pushed it open. Sophie wore gloves and held a black trash bag in her hands. Pretending to do her routine, she moved silently, collecting disposable cups and crumpled napkins from the side tables. But her curious eyes missed nothing. Inside, the argument was heating up. "This is unacceptable," one of the directors shouted. "A company like Straton can't rely on outdated systems." "And whose fault is that?" another snapped back. "The markets, the clients, or the man sitting in the CEO's chair?" All eyes turned to Robert. He kept his posture, but his shoulders were visibly tense. "The fault is stagnation," he replied firmly. "We were so focused on maintaining the image of a million-dollar company that we forgot to innovate. Our competitors moved ahead with AI, automation, and smart systems, while we still depend on manual processes." A low murmur filled the room. With her back turned, Sophie paused discreetly to listen better, pretending to wipe down a side table. Robert continued, "We're spending money where we shouldn't. We have idle machines, repeated processes, and software running on expensive servers that deliver no results. We're literally burning money." He took a deep breath. "And if nothing changes, in 3 months we'll be technically bankrupt." A younger board member leaned forward, desperate. "And what do you suggest, Robert?" Robert looked back at the chart as if searching for a way out inside it. "Cuts. A full restructuring. We need to reduce costs by at least 40% immediately." The reaction was instant. "Cuts?" a woman on the board exclaimed. "That would mean mass layoffs." "Exactly," Robert replied, calm. "I don't want that, but I don't see another way." The murmurs grew. Everyone started talking at once, voices mixed with anger and despair. Sophie, still quiet, walked toward the trash bin near Robert's desk and bent down to change the bag. As she did, her eyes glanced at the screen. She looked at the charts, the percentages, the open reports. In seconds, she understood what was happening. "They're going under because they don't see what's right in front of them," she thought, biting her lip to keep from laughing. "Robert," one of the directors said, trying to calm the chaos, "we can't just shut down our research department. That would destroy us in the long run. What will destroy us is continuing to spend on technology that doesn't work," Robert replied. A heavy silence filled the room. Sophie lifted her head, curious. Robert turned to the screen and showed a new projection. "This is our operational margin of error," he explained. 38%. Almost half of our spending is wasted on redundant tasks, integration failures, and wrong automated decisions. One board member's eyes widened. "You're telling me we lose nearly half of our revenue because of the system?" "Exactly," Robert confirmed. "The software we use for management takes in more than it gives, and the updates cost more than the actual profit. Sophie was still there, pretending to clean an invisible stain on the floor. Every word sounded like music to her. "A system that takes in more than it gives," she repeated silently, and a spark of an idea began to form. Suddenly, one of the directors stood up and slammed his hand on the table. "This is a disaster. If we don't cut expenses now, we'll have to shut down." "I know," Robert replied, louder than he meant to. "That's why I'm here, telling you Stratton is on the verge of collapse." The shouting returned. Arguments, accusations, empty promises. While everyone fought, Sophie quietly finished collecting the trash, moving with almost poetic calm. She looked at each face in the room and saw the same pattern: fear, pride, vanity. Everyone trying to save their own job, and no one trying to save the company. When she was done, she left unnoticed. In the quiet hallway, the distant noise of the boardroom still echoed. Sophie rested the trash bag on the cart and looked up at the ceiling, deep in thought. If they're losing money with a dumb system, why not create one that thinks? The idea hit her like a snap, simple and powerful. She looked at the badge on her chest, Sophie Hayes Cleaning and Maintenance, and smiled. Maybe the cleaning they need isn't on the floor, but in the code, she whispered. As the elevator went down, her mind was already at work, connecting everything she'd heard. An artificial intelligence software that could reorganize data, eliminate flaws, and cut costs by 42%, maybe more. When the doors opened on the ground floor, Sophie pushed the cart toward the exit, heart racing. Upstairs, the board was still debating layoffs. But the future of Stratton had already changed, and it was in the hands of the one person they'd never notice. And in that moment, as the building's lights reflected on the night glass, the company's destiny was quietly rewritten by an invisible janitor with the mind of a genius. That night, the lights at Stratton Technology were off, except for a faint glow under the door of the janitor's closet in the basement. Sophie Hayes was sitting on a green plastic stool, surrounded by buckets, mops, and cleaning supplies. In front of her, on a makeshift shelf made of cardboard boxes, sat an old laptop she'd bought at a thrift store years ago. The screen was dim but bright enough to light up her focused face. Beside her, a mug of cold coffee, already the third refill of the night, sat waiting to be forgotten again. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Lines of code appeared on the screen like magic, one after another, building something that didn't have a name yet, but already had a purpose. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured to the computer, as if talking to a stubborn dog. "You're going to behave now, or I'll have to wipe you clean again." The cursor blinked. She smiled. "Good, let's get to it." Sophie wasn't a trained programmer, but she had something better: endless curiosity and monk-like patience. For the past 5 years, while cleaning empty offices at night, she'd been studying, watching videos, reading tutorials, downloading manuals. She taught herself Python, then JavaScript, then machine learning, all because she believed in one simple thing: no one is born knowing. But anyone can learn. And now there, among brooms and disinfectants, she was creating artificial intelligence software. The idea was clear: a system capable of analyzing data in real time, spotting operational flaws, automating repetitive tasks, and most of all, cutting waste. If it worked, it could cut costs by 42%. Maybe more. 42, she said out loud, typing the number into the code. Perfect number. It's the answer to everything, right? Thanks, Douglas Adams. She laughed to herself, took another sip of cold coffee, and made a face. Ugh, tastes like old tire. But she kept drinking anyway. The hours went by. The code grew. Sophie switched between whispering commands to herself, quietly cursing when things went wrong, and celebrating with small fist pumps when things worked. "Yes, there we go, sweetie," she exclaimed when one function ran perfectly. "Look at you behaving. Who's a good girl? You are." By 4 in the morning, the system began to take shape. She built a simple but functional interface. Not pretty, not fancy, but efficient. The software could read reports, cross-check information, detect redundancies, and suggest automatic corrections. It was like having an invisible assistant who never slept and never complained. Sophie leaned back on the stool and sighed, exhausted but satisfied. "All set," she said, looking at the screen like someone admiring a work of art. "Now you just need to be tested in the real world." She saved everything on 3 different flash drives, shut down the laptop, and packed it into an old backpack. When she left the storage room, the sky was still dark, but the first light of dawn was beginning to show on the horizon. Sophie went upstairs, changed clothes in the locker room, and put her janitor uniform back on. Another workday. Another chance to change everything. The morning at Straighten Technology started like any other. Busy, noisy, and full of people rushing around. Sophie was pushing her cleaning cart down the 10th floor hallway, going unnoticed by the executives rushing past with their briefcases and phones. But today, she had a mission. She needed to present her idea to someone important. Someone who might listen and maybe take it further. She knew she couldn't just knock on the CEO's door. She needed a middleman. And that's when she saw James Carter, Robert King's personal assistant, hurrying toward the elevator. "Mr. Carter," she called out, picking up her pace. He stopped, turned around, and looked at her like he didn't have a second to spare. "Yes?" Sophie took a deep breath and spoke quickly. "I know you're busy, but I need to talk to Mr. King. I have a solution for the company's financial problems." James looked her up and down, noticing the uniform, the name badge, the cart. "You work in cleaning?" "I do, but that's not what matters. What matters is that I created a software that can save Straton." He let out a short laugh, almost a scoff. "A software? You?" "Yes, me. It's an artificial intelligence system that—" "Look," James interrupted, raising his hand. "I don't have time for jokes. If you have suggestions, send them to HR by email." And he turned away. Sophie stood there, watching him step into the elevator. "Okay," she murmured. "Plan B, then." She kept going, but she didn't give up. She decided to try her luck directly. She went up 2 more floors, where Robert King's office was. When she got there, the door was slightly open. She took a deep breath and knocked gently. "Come in," said a deep voice from inside. Sophie slowly pushed the door open and walked in. Robert King was sitting behind a huge desk going through some papers. He looked up and frowned when he saw her. "Who are you?" "Sophie Hayes, sir. I work in cleaning." He raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want?" "I have a solution for the company's problems," she said, trying to sound confident. "I created an artificial intelligence software that can reduce costs by 42%. Robert stared at her for a long moment. Then he started laughing. Not a polite laugh, a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the room. "You?" he said, still laughing. "The janitor created an AI software?" "Yes, sir. That's hilarious." He cut her off, still laughing. "What's next? The security guards offering financial advice?" Sophie clenched her fists but kept her voice steady. "I know it sounds strange, but—" "Strange?" Robert stood up, leaning his hands on the desk. "It's ridiculous. Do you really think I'm going to waste my time listening to the mop engineer?" The word stung. Sophie felt her face heat up, but she didn't let it show. "All right, sir," she said calmly. "I just came to offer help." And she left. Outside, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. "Mop engineer," she repeated in her mind. Then she smiled. "Okay, Robert, you're going to swallow those words." 3 hours later, chaos began. Suddenly, all the screens at Stratton Technology flickered and went dark. Computers froze, systems shut down. The entire building was hit by a tech blackout. Shouts echoed through the halls. Employees ran around in panic. "What happened?" "We lost everything." "Somebody call IT." Robert stormed out of his office furious. "I want answers. Now." While everyone was panicking, Sophie was moving quietly through the basement halls. She knew exactly what to do. She plugged her flash drive into a central system terminal, typed a series of commands, and activated her software. The screen blinked. The code ran, and, in less than 3 minutes, everything was back. Lights came on. Computers restarted. Systems returned to normal. Silence fell over the building. Everyone looked around, confused. How did that happen?" a director asked. Robert, still in the control room, looked at the main screen. "I want to know who fixed this," he ordered. A technician checked the access logs. "Sir, it came from the lower level, Terminal B12. "Who?" The technician clicked through some files. A name popped up on the screen. "Sophie Hayes. Cleaning and maintenance." Robert went silent, staring at the monitor. For the first time in years, the millionaire CEO was completely speechless. And downstairs, Sophie was slipping the flash drive into her backpack, smiling. "Welcome to the future, boss." Robert King called an emergency board meeting. The message was clear. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions. As the members started arriving, tension filled the room. Everyone wanted answers about the blackout from the day before. and especially about the miraculous recovery no one could explain. Robert sat at the head of the table, his face stern, fingers tapping the glass top. Beside him, one chair remained empty. The door opened, every eye turned, and then Sophie Hayes walked in. She wore the same janitor's uniform as always, with a worn-out backpack on her shoulder and a flash drive in her hand. The board members exchanged confused looks. "What is the cleaning lady doing here?" asked a woman with gold-rimmed glasses. Robert raised his hand for silence. "Take your seats," he said, looking straight at Sophie. "You two." Sophie pulled out the empty chair and sat down, placing her backpack on the floor. She was nervous. Her hands were sweaty. Her heart was racing, but she kept her posture steady. Robert began. "Yesterday at 3 in the afternoon, Straighten Technology experienced a full tech blackout. All systems shut down. We lost connection to servers, clients, and suppliers. It was the worst incident in the company's history." The board members nodded, still visibly shaken. "But then," Robert continued, his tone even more serious, "someone fixed everything in under 3 minutes, and that person is sitting right here in this room." All eyes turned to Sophie. She gave a shy smile and waved. "Hi." One of the board members, a bald man in a red tie, frowned. "Wait, are you saying the janitor fixed our system?" "Not just fixed it," Robert said, crossing his arms. "She implemented an entirely new software, and I want her to explain how." The room went completely silent. Sophie cleared her throat, stood up, and plugged the flash drive into a laptop on the table. The main screen lit up, showing lines of code and organized charts. "Well," she began, brushing her hair back, "I created an artificial intelligence software. Here's how it works. It reads data in real time, spots flaws in the processes, automates repetitive tasks, and suggests automatic corrections." She clicked on a tab. A graph popped up. "Here, you can see that Straton's system was wasting 48% of its resources on redundant processes. My software cuts that. Estimated savings, 42% in operational costs." The board members looked at each other, stunned. 42%? Repeated the woman in gold-rimmed glasses. "That's right," Sophie confirmed. "It's like, you know when you have 3 people doing the same job and no one notices? My system notices. And fixes it." Robert leaned forward, his eyes locked on her. "How did you learn to do this?" Sophie shrugged. "YouTube, articles, a few study guides I found online. Oh, and a lot of trial and error. A whole lot." One board member laughed, unbelieving. "You're kidding." "No," she replied, serious. "All I needed was time and coffee." Lots of coffee. The room filled with murmurs. Some were laughing, others looked stunned. Robert raised his hand again, calling for order. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. "We have an entire IT department, engineers, experts, and you're telling me a janitor solved something they couldn't?" Sophie looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." Robert's stare was full of challenge. "I don't believe it." "Then test it," Sophie replied, folding her arms. "Run the system. Look at the results. If it doesn't work, I'll leave and never bother anyone again." One of the board members slapped the table. "I think we should test it, right away." Another one agreed. "If it really works, this could save the company." Robert took a deep breath, clearly irritated, but nodded. "All right, run the tests." 3 days went by, and the results were overwhelming. Sophie's software didn't just work, it exceeded every expectation. The company's productivity jumped by 35%. Operational costs dropped by 43%. Tasks that used to take hours were now done in minutes. The financial reports showed something Straton hadn't seen in months: real profit. Employee morale changed too. Tiring, repetitive tasks were automated, allowing teams to focus on more creative projects. At the next board meeting, the atmosphere was completely different. The board members were excited, some even smiling. "This is amazing," said the woman with the gold glasses. "In just 3 days, we turned things around." Another board member, an older man, was flipping through a printed report. "I want to know more about this young lady. Who is she? Where did she come from?" Robert, sitting in the corner of the room, kept a serious expression. An assistant came in with a folder and handed it to the chairman, a gray-haired man named Gregory Palmer. Gregory opened the folder and read aloud, "Sophie Hayes, bachelor's degree in business administration from NYU, master's in software engineering from Cornell University." The room went quiet. "Wait," said a board member, confused. "She has 2 degrees?" Gregory continued. "Yes, and with honors in both." But she left her career 5 years ago to take care of her sick mother. After that, she took a job as a janitor here at Straton to pay the bills. Now the silence was one of respect. Gregory closed the folder and looked around. Gentlemen, we have a genius working as a janitor. That is unacceptable. He turned to Sophie, who was sitting quietly in the corner. Miss Hayes, as of today, you're no longer a janitor. You are the new interim director of operations at Straton Industries. Sophie's eyes widened. What? You heard me, Gregory said, smiling. We want you leading this company. Robert stood up suddenly, slamming his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. She has no management experience. She has 2 degrees, Robert, Gregory replied calmly, and she just saved our company. That's experience enough. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but Gregory raised his hand. The decision is final. Sophie was still trying to process everything when Gregory added, and one more thing. You and Robert will co-lead Straton's next big project. I want both of you working side by side. The look Robert gave Sophie was cold, filled with anger and resentment. She simply smiled. Looking forward to it, boss. Robert didn't reply. He just turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Gregory sighed. He'll get used to it. Sophie chuckled softly. I doubt it, but deep down she knew everything had changed. The invisible janitor was now in charge, and this was just the beginning. The next morning, Sophie arrived at her new office on the 12th floor. The room was small, but it had a window overlooking the city and a glass desk that caught the sunlight. Nothing like Robert's grand office, but it was hers. She set her backpack on the chair and looked around, still taking it all in. Interim Director of Operations, she whispered, testing the words aloud. Sounds like a retired superhero name. There was a knock on the door. Come in, she said, taking a seat. The door opened, and James Carter, Robert's assistant, walked in with a stack of folders. Good morning, Miss Hayes. These are the urgent requests that need approval. Sophie picked up the first folder and skimmed through it quickly. All right, I'll go over everything and get back to you by the end of the day. James hesitated. Mr. King usually takes 3 days to approve these. Sophie looked up and smiled. Well, I'm not Mr. King. James nodded, clearly relieved, and left. Sophie got to work, but it didn't take long to realize that working with Robert would be complicated. The first joint meeting happened 2 hours later. The room was full of managers and directors. Sophie sat on one side of the table. Robert sat on the other. The mood was tense. Robert opened the meeting with a firm, controlled voice. We need to discuss the restructuring of the sales department. My proposal is to increase the team by 20% and invest in intensive training. Sophie raised her hand. Can I suggest something else? Robert looked at her with impatience. Go ahead. Instead of growing the team, what if we optimize the processes we already have? The AI software can automate reports, market analysis, even client prospecting. We save money and boost efficiency. Robert crossed his arms. Not everything can be solved with technology, Miss Hayes. And not everything has to be solved by spending more money, Mr. King, Sophie replied, keeping her tone light. Some employees exchanged glances and held back smiles. Robert took a deep breath. My experience tells me that trained people are more reliable than machines. And my experience tells me that trained people do better when they're not buried under repetitive tasks, Sophie responded, leaning forward. The software frees up their time so they can focus on what really matters, selling. Silence filled the room. Everyone waited for Robert's reaction. He pressed his lips together and, finally, nodded. All right then, let's test your proposal. But if it doesn't work, we go back to my plan. Sophie smiled. Deal. The meeting continued, but the tension between them was obvious. Every decision turned into a verbal duel disguised as a technical debate. When it ended, employees left the room quietly laughing among themselves. They're either going to kill each other or get married, one manager whispered in the hallway. Outside the company, Sophie was doing her best to stay sane. Later that afternoon, she returned to her neighborhood. A modest place, but full of life. She stopped in front of Mrs. Jenkins's house, an elderly neighbor who lived alone. Hi, Mrs. Jenkins. Need help with anything? The woman appeared at the window, smiling. Oh, Sophie, dear, could you change the kitchen light bulb? I can't reach it. Of course. Sophie went in, grabbed a chair, and changed the bulb in less than 5 minutes. All done. Now it's shining like a diamond. Mrs. Jenkins laughed. You're an angel, sweetheart. Sophie stepped outside and saw a group of kids playing on the sidewalk. Aunt Sophie, a boy around 7, shouted, "Come play tag with us." She dropped her backpack and ran after the kids, laughing loud, forgetting, for a few minutes, all about meetings, software, and arrogant CEOs. There, she was just Sophie. And that was enough. Meanwhile, Robert was at the gym, punching a heavy bag like it was his worst enemy. Right, left, right again. But Sophie's smile from the meeting kept flashing in his mind. How dare she? He muttered through clenched teeth. Just shows up out of nowhere and thinks she can change everything. Another punch, and another, and another. The trainer came over. "Take it easy, Robert. That bag didn't do anything to you." Robert stopped, breathing heavily. Sorry. But deep down, he knew he wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself for not seeing the solution earlier, for underestimating someone so brilliant. And that made it worse. A few days later, Gregory Palmer called both Robert and Sophie for a joint assignment to represent Strain Technology at a tech industry event. The event would take place at a luxury hotel in downtown New York, gathering CEOs, investors, and journalists. Sophie was thrilled when she heard, "Great, I love these events. Free food, interesting people." Robert, on the other hand, looked like he was heading into a torture session. That night, Sophie wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated. Robert showed up in a flawless gray suit. When they met in the hotel lobby, he looked her up and down. "You look presentable." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Thank you, Your Majesty. You almost look human." He didn't answer, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. During the event, they walked side by side, greeting investors and answering questions about Straton. But the tension between them was clear. "So, Miss Hayes," one investor said, curious, "I heard you used to be a janitor. How was that transition?" Sophie smiled. "It was easy. I was already used to cleaning up other people's messes. Now I just do it at a corporate level." Laughter echoed around them. Robert forced a polite smile. Later, as they walked through the ballroom, Sophie commented, "You know, you could try relaxing a little. Smiling won't set off a fire alarm." "I smile when I have a reason to," he replied. "Must be hard then. Living like that, always serious, always in control." She paused. "Always alone." Robert stopped walking and looked straight at her. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," Sophie replied calmly. "I know you're afraid of losing control. I know you hate asking for help. And I know it drives you crazy that I solved something you couldn't." His eyes lit up with anger, and something else. "Careful, Miss Hayes, you're treading dangerous ground." "I've never been afraid of danger," she said, shrugging. For a moment they stood there, staring at each other, and something shifted between them. It wasn't just anger. It was something else. But before either of them could say anything, Robert's phone rang. He answered, listened for a few seconds, and his face went pale. "What? When?" He hung up and looked at Sophie. "We have a problem. The AI system has been hit by a cyber attack. The company is shut down." Sophie's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, but we need to go, now." They rushed out of the event and got in the car. On the way back, Robert called the IT team. "I want full reports. I want to know where the attack came from." Sophie stayed silent, thinking fast. When they arrived at Straton, the security team was already investigating. Then, the lead technician handed Robert a report. "Mr. King, all digital traces point to a single terminal." "Which one?" The technician swallowed hard. "Yours, sir." Silence fell like a guillotine. Robert turned pale. Sophie looked at him, stunned, and for the first time the millionaire CEO looked completely lost. The next morning, the boardroom was more tense than ever. All the members were present, seated around the glass table with serious expressions. In the center of the table, a laptop displayed technical reports, access logs, and evidence of the cyber attack. Robert King sat alone on one side, his face closed, shoulders tight. Gregory Palmer opened the meeting with a solemn voice. "Gentlemen, we're here to discuss a serious incident. Straton's artificial intelligence system was attacked last night, causing a total shutdown of operations, and all the evidence points to Mr. King's terminal." A murmur spread through the room. Robert sat up straight. "I didn't do this." "No one's accusing you yet," Gregory said calmly, "but we need to understand what happened." One of the board members, a man with thin glasses and gray hair, raised his hand. "Mr. Palmer, I reviewed the logs. The attack started at 10:30 p.m. The terminal used belonged to Mr. King with his login and password. How is that possible if he was at the corporate event? Robert replied firmly. Someone used my credentials. That's obvious. Obvious? Another board member challenged. Or convenient? The tension rose. Sophie, sitting in the corner of the room, raised her hand. May I speak? Gregory nodded. Of course, Miss Hayes. Sophie stood and walked over to the laptop. I reviewed the logs too, and something seems off. The attack started at 10:30, but Mr. King was with me at the event at that exact time. There are dozens of witnesses. That only proves someone used his terminal remotely, said the man with glasses. Exactly, Sophie agreed. Someone with high-level access, someone who knows the system from the inside. Gregory frowned. You're suggesting it was someone from within the company? I'm saying this needs a more careful investigation, Sophie replied. We can't just accuse Mr. King without solid proof. An uncomfortable silence settled. Then another board member pulled up a new report on the screen. There's something else. The attack didn't just shut the system down. It also transferred confidential data to an external server, and that data was accessed using Mr. King's authentication codes. Robert clenched his fists. This is a setup. Maybe it is, Gregory said, letting out a sigh. But until we prove your innocence, we can't ignore the evidence. He paused and looked around the table. I propose a temporary suspension of Mr. King until the investigation is complete. The vote was quick. 6 in favor, 2 against. Robert stood slowly, his face red with restrained anger. This is ridiculous. It's temporary, Robert, Gregory said in a calm tone. Just until we clear things up. Robert looked at Sophie. She met his gaze but said nothing. He grabbed his jacket, turned his back, and left the room without another word. When the door closed, Gregory turned to Sophie. Miss Hayes, until Mr. King returns, you'll serve as interim CEO. Sophie blinked, surprised. Me? But You're the most qualified person right now, Gregory interrupted. And the company needs leadership. Do you accept? Sophie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I accept. In the days that followed, Sophie took charge of Stratton. She moved into Robert's office, reorganized processes, and tried to keep the company running. But despite all her competence, the weight of loneliness was almost unbearable. At night, sitting alone in the empty office, looking at the lit-up city through the window, Sophie missed the heated arguments with Robert. Who would have thought I'd miss fighting with you? She murmured into the silence. Outside the company, Robert was trying to clear his name. He talked to lawyers, cybersecurity experts, private investigators, but no one could prove his innocence. The evidence was too solid. He called former colleagues, tried to schedule meetings with board members. Everyone ignored him. For the first time in his life, Robert King was alone, and it hurt more than he expected. Meanwhile, Sophie didn't give up. She knew something was wrong. The evidence was too neat, too well organized. Someone had planned it carefully. Late at night, alone in the office, she began reviewing the logs again, line by line, code by code. And then, she found it. A small inconsistency in the timestamps. The records showed the attack started at 10:30, but Robert's terminal log had been edited. Someone forged this, she whispered, leaning closer to the screen. She followed the trail. She found out that Robert's login had been cloned from another terminal, and that terminal belonged to a company director, Thomas Brennan, the head of IT security. Sophie's eyes widened. You scumbag, she muttered. She copied all the evidence, saved it onto 3 different flash drives, and started putting together a detailed report. By the time the sun came up, she had everything she needed. The next morning, Sophie called for an emergency board meeting. Thomas Brennan was there, sitting calmly, with no idea of what was coming. Gregory Palmer opened the meeting. Miss Hayes, you asked for this meeting. What's going on? Sophie stood up and plugged her flash drive into the laptop. I found out who really attacked our system. All eyes turned to her. And it wasn't Mr. King. Thomas shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Sophie showed the logs on the screen. These are the original records of the attack. You can see here that Mr. King's login was cloned from another terminal, and that terminal belongs to Mr. Brennan. The board erupted in murmurs. Thomas stood up, trying to stay calm. This is ridiculous. Why would I do that? Good question, Sophie replied, crossing her arms. Maybe because you were selling Stratton's confidential data to our competitors, And when my software started tracking those leaks, you had to wipe the evidence. She clicked on another file. These are the bank transfer records from your account. 3 large deposits, all from Helix Corp., our biggest rival. Thomas turned pale. Gregory stood up, furious. Is this true, Thomas? Thomas tried to explain, but couldn't. The evidence was undeniable. Minutes later, security escorted him out of the building. The press was already outside, capturing everything. Gregory turned to Sophie. You saved this company, and you cleared Robert's name. Sophie nodded, tired. He deserves to come back. I agree, Gregory said. I'll reinstate him right away. 2 days later, Robert King returned to Stratton Industries. He walked into the building with the same strong posture as always, but something in his eyes had changed. Something colder, more guarded. Sophie was waiting for him in the lobby. When he saw her, he stopped. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds. Finally, Robert spoke. Thank you for saving me. Sophie gave a small smile. You're welcome. He stepped closer, his face serious. But this doesn't change anything between us. She raised an eyebrow. I didn't expect it to. Robert stared at her a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the elevator. Sophie stood still, watching him go, and for the first time, she felt the tension between them was stronger than ever. The next day, Robert King resumed control at Straton Technology as if he had never left. He arrived early, reviewed reports, reorganized schedules, and called meetings without asking anyone, especially not Sophie. When she got to the office that morning, she found a pile of messages from him in her inbox, all with direct orders, none with questions. Well, good morning to you too, sweetheart, she muttered, rolling her eyes. The first meeting of the day was a disaster waiting to happen. Robert entered the room with a folder under his arm and started talking before even sitting down. We're going to restructure the logistics department. My proposal is to centralize all operations into one distribution center. Sophie, sitting across the table, raised her hand. May I suggest something? Robert looked at her impatiently. Go ahead. Centralizing everything will create a huge bottleneck. If something goes wrong at that one center, the whole company shuts down. How about decentralizing and using the AI software to coordinate everything in real time? Robert crossed his arms. Decentralization leads to duplicate costs, and centralization leads to concentrated risk, Sophie shot back, leaning forward. Besides, the software already handles the coordination at no extra cost. It's like having 5 brains working together instead of just one. Some of the managers nodded quietly. Robert pressed his lips together. I have 20 years of management experience, Miss Hayes. I know what works. And I have a software that proves you're wrong, she replied with an innocent smile. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert took a deep breath, clearly annoyed. All right, we'll test your idea. But when it fails, we go back to my plan. When it works, you'll thank me, Sophie said with a wink. The employees exchanged glances and small smiles. The chemistry between them was obvious, even if it was explosive. Gregory Palmer, watching from the corner of the room, made a mental note. Those two together were gold. They just needed to stop fighting long enough to see it. The week moved at a frantic pace. Robert ignored Sophie's suggestions in public, but quietly used some of them behind the scenes. She noticed, but pretended not to, just to avoid embarrassing him. In another meeting, he cut her presentation off midway. This won't work. Sophie paused, looked at him, and smiled. You've said that 3 times this week, and every time, it worked. Robert opened his mouth to reply, but had nothing to say. The employees chuckled quietly. He got up and walked out, slamming the door. Sophie sighed and looked at the others. He'll get used to it, eventually. Later that afternoon, Sophie decided to leave early. She needed some air, a little peace of mind. She walked into a small, cozy cafe 2 blocks from the office, ordered a cappuccino, and sat by the window. She was flipping through a book when she heard a familiar voice. Does this place serve real coffee or just colored water? She looked up and saw Robert standing by the table, holding a cup. Depends on your standards, Sophie replied with a half smile. If you're expecting liquid gold, you'll be disappointed. Robert hesitated, then pulled up the chair across from her and sat down. May I? You already did. He took a sip and made a face. Awful, Sophie laughed, but you'll drink it anyway because you paid for it. Robert gave a small, reluctant smile, a rare one. You know me too well. The conversation started off tense, as usual. He complained about one of her decisions. She responded with sharp logic, but little by little, the tension faded. Robert talked about an old project that had failed. Sophie laughed and shared a story about the time she accidentally deleted an entire database while learning to code. "You did what?" he asked, stunned. "I deleted everything," she said, laughing. 3 months of work. I had to start all over." "And you didn't give up?" "Of course not. I'm way too stubborn for that." Robert looked at her for a moment, something different in his eyes. "I can tell." They stayed there for over an hour, talking, laughing, no arguing. When they finally got up to leave, Robert held the door for her. "Well, that was unexpected," he said. "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" Sophie asked. He paused. "Good, definitely good." She smiled. Who would have thought? The great Robert King saying something nice. He rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. The next morning, Gregory Palmer called Robert and Sophie into a private meeting. "We've got a new project," he announced. "Our Chicago branch is facing serious operational issues. We need someone to go there, assess the situation, and implement solutions." He looked at both of them. "And I want you to do it together." Robert frowned. "Together? Yes, you're the best team we have. Work together, fix the problem, and come back." Sophie looked at Robert. He looked at her. "All right," she said with a shrug. "I'm in." Robert sighed. "Me too." Gregory smiled. "Great, you leave tomorrow morning." The flight was a mix of arguments, jabs, and awkward silences. Robert reviewed documents. Sophie worked on her laptop, adjusting code. "You never stop, do you?" he said. "Neither do you," she replied, eyes still on the screen. When they arrived in Chicago, they went straight to the branch. The place was a mess. Employees were rushing everywhere, systems kept crashing, and the local manager looked like he was about to lose it. "We need help. Fast," he said, desperate. Robert took charge right away, assigning tasks and organizing teams. Sophie dove into the systems, identifying flaws and fixing processes. They worked side by side for hours, and for the first time, they worked perfectly together. Robert gave clear instructions. Sophie executed with precision. When he doubted something, she showed him the data. When she hesitated, he made the call. By the end of the day, the branch was already running better. But then, an alarm echoed through the halls. The AI system began to crash. Data started disappearing. Sophie rushed to the main server. "What's happening?" Robert asked right behind her. "Critical error in the core code," she answered, typing fast. "If I don't fix it now, we'll lose everything." Minutes felt like hours. Robert stood beside her, watching. "Can you fix it?" he asked, tense. Sophie didn't answer. She just kept typing. And then finally, the screen blinked. The system came back online. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted. "I did it." Robert let out a breath he'd been holding. "Thank you." Sophie looked at him, surprised. "Did you just thank me?" He gave a small smile. "Don't get used to it." But for the first time, Robert King had fully trusted Sophie Hayes, and both of them knew something between them was starting to change. The next day, the atmosphere at the Chicago branch was completely different. The systems were working perfectly. The employees seemed more motivated, and Sophie was right at the center of it all, leading with energy and creativity. She called a meeting with the entire local team. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have a group activity." The employees exchanged curious glances. Robert, sitting in the back of the room, frowned. "A group activity? Is that really necessary?" Sophie turned to him with a big smile. "Absolutely, and you're joining us too, boss." He opened his mouth to protest, but she was already handing out colored papers and pens. "Come on, Mr. King, don't be shy." The employees chuckled quietly. Robert sighed but took the paper. The activity was simple. Each person had to write down a problem they faced at work and then trade papers with someone else to come up with creative solutions. Sophie walked around the room, making jokes and encouraging everyone. "That's it, folks. Think outside the box, or inside the box, if it's a creative one." Robert watched, still skeptical, but he started to notice how well the team was responding. People were laughing, talking, working together. When it was his turn to share a solution, he stood up, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, I suggest we automate the budget approval process." Sophie clapped her hands. "Perfect. See? That wasn't so hard. Now sit back and relax. You're doing great." He sat down, trying to hide a smile. By the end of the activity, the team was energized. Even Robert seemed more relaxed. I'll admit, he said quietly, standing next to Sophie, this actually worked. She winked. I know, it always does. In the afternoon, the sky darkened quickly. Heavy clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. Within minutes, a violent storm hit Chicago. Thunder echoed. Rain pounded against the windows. The branch manager made an announcement. Everyone, we're closing early. This storm's going to get worse. The employees rushed out. In minutes, the building was nearly empty. Sophie and Robert stayed behind, finishing up a few final reports. Aren't you going home? He asked. I'll wait for the rain to calm down a bit, she replied, looking out the window. And you? Same here. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain. Then the lights flickered and went out. The building was suddenly dark. Great, Robert muttered. Just what we needed. Sophie laughed. Relax, it's just a temporary power outage. She turned on the flashlight on her phone and lit the way to a nearby break room, where there were couches and a small window. Let's wait here. It's more comfortable. They sat down, one on each end of the couch, listening to the storm outside. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt different, more personal. Can I ask you something? Robert said, breaking the silence. Of course. Why did you create that software? The AI. Why? Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. Because I got tired of seeing smart people get ignored. People with great ideas that no one listens to because they're not in the right positions. I created the software to prove that solutions can come from anywhere. Robert slowly nodded. You're talking about yourself. I am, she admitted. But not just me. I'm talking about everyone who's invisible. Janitors, security guards, assistants. People others walk past without even noticing. He stayed quiet for a moment. I walked past you, he said, his voice low. More than once. Sophie shrugged. You weren't the first, and you probably won't be the last. But I should have noticed, Robert insisted, and I'm sorry I didn't. She looked at him, surprised. Robert King apologizing? Twice in 2 days? Who are you, and what did you do with my grumpy boss? He let out a quiet laugh. Maybe you're changing me. The mood shifted. The tension in the air was noticeable. Sophie looked away, trying to hide her nerves. And you? She asked. Why is it so hard for you to trust people? Robert took a deep breath. Because I'm afraid of failing. I always have been. Since I was a kid, I was told I had to be perfect. That one mistake would be the end. And I carried that with me my whole life. Sophie looked at him with empathy. But you don't have to be perfect, Robert. Nobody does. I know, he said, his voice tight. But it's hard to accept that. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then, almost without realizing it, their hands touched. It was a soft, hesitant touch, but neither pulled away. Robert leaned in slightly. Sophie did too. And before either of them could overthink it, their lips met. The kiss was gentle, full of all the tension built up over the past few weeks. When they pulled away, both were breathless. That was, Robert began. Unexpected? Sophie asked with a shy smile. Yes, but good. They left the building once the storm had passed, walking side by side to the hotel. In the room, the conversation went on. They laughed, shared more stories, and the closeness slowly turned into something more. And that night, they gave in to what they felt. No fear, no walls. For the first time, Sophie and Robert weren't CEO and director. They were just two people who met in the most unlikely place. The next morning, sunlight filled the room. Sophie woke up first, looked at Robert sleeping beside her, and smiled. But when he opened his eyes, reality came back. They got dressed in silence, exchanged quick glances, pretending nothing had happened. Good morning, Robert said, fixing his tie. Good morning, Sophie replied, trying to sound casual. On the way to the airport, the conversation was strangely formal. I think we managed to solve the branch's problems, he said. Yes, the team is on the right track, she agreed. But their eyes told a different story. Every time they looked at each other, the memory of the night before came rushing back. When the plane took off toward New York, both remained quiet, lost in thought. When they landed, Gregory Palmer was waiting for them at the airport, his expression serious. We need to talk. It's urgent. What happened? Robert asked. Gregory handed them a tablet. On the screen, news headlines. Scandal at Stratton. Corrupt director had accomplices. New fraud threatens CEO and operations director. Sophie's eyes widened. What? Gregory sighed. Thomas Brennan didn't act alone, and now his accomplices are trying to destroy both of your reputations before they get exposed. Robert clenched his fists. Who are they? We're still investigating, but get ready. This is going to get ugly. Sophie looked at Robert. He looked back at her, and together they knew the battle was just beginning. The next day, the situation exploded. That morning, anonymous emails began circulating among Straton Industries shareholders. The emails contained allegedly confidential documents showing Sophie and Robert had diverted company funds into personal accounts. The evidence looked solid: bank transfers, digital signatures, even edited audio recordings. Gregory Palmer called an emergency board meeting. When Sophie and Robert walked into the room, the atmosphere was ice cold. "Sit down," Gregory ordered, his voice low and serious. They sat side by side, tense. One of the board members, a woman with short hair named Linda Foster, threw a stack of papers on the table. "Explain this." Sophie picked up the papers and started reading. Her eyes widened. "This is fake. I never authorized these transfers." Robert grabbed another document and frowned. "This too. My signature was forged." "That's what all guilty people say," said another board member, a man with round glasses named Harold Bennett. Gregory raised his hand to quiet the room. "You have 24 hours to prove your innocence. If not, the board will vote to remove you both." Sophie looked at Robert. He looked at her. "We'll prove it," she said firmly. They spent the rest of the day locked in Robert's office, reviewing every document, every email, every line of code. Sophie was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, laptop on her lap. Robert paced back and forth on the phone with lawyers. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed after hanging up. "The evidence is too good. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Sophie looked up. "Then we'll be better than them." She opened the AI software and started feeding it all the available data: access logs, document metadata, IP records. "What are you doing?" Robert asked. "Using our own system against them," she answered without looking away from the screen. "If someone planted this evidence, they left a digital trail, and the AI will find it." Robert kneeled next to her. "You really think this will work?" Sophie gave a faint smile. "Do you trust me?" He hesitated for a second, then nodded. "I do." Hours passed. Cold coffee, half-eaten sandwiches, rising tension. But then the AI started returning results. "Here," Sophie said, pointing at the screen. "Look at this. All the documents were created from the same IP, and that IP doesn't belong to us." Robert leaned in to see better. "Whose is it?" Sophie clicked through a few more files. "It's from inside Straton's own network, but from a specific terminal, Linda Foster's terminal." Robert's eyes widened. "The board member?" "There's more," Sophie continued, typing quickly. "She worked with Harold Bennett. Look here, messages between the two of them planning everything." Robert read the messages in disbelief. They wanted to get us out of the way to take control of the company. Sophie saved everything onto multiple flash drives. "We've got the proof. Now we just have to present it." Robert looked at her, impressed. "You're brilliant." She blinked. "I know, but thanks for noticing." The next day, the board called a live meeting with the shareholders. The room was packed. Cameras, reporters, executives, all waiting for the verdict. Linda Foster and Harold Bennett sat at the table, confident. Gregory Palmer opened the meeting. "We're here to discuss the accusations against CEO Robert King and Chief Operations Officer Sophie Hayes. Miss Foster, you have the floor." Linda stood up, smiling. "Thank you, Mr. Palmer. The evidence is clear. Mr. King and Miss Hayes diverted company funds for personal gain. We propose their immediate removal." A wave of murmurs went through the room. Gregory looked at Robert. "Mr. King, do you have something to say?" Robert stood up calmly. "Yes, I do." He nodded to Sophie, who connected her laptop to the projector. "You're right," Robert said. "Someone did divert funds, but it wasn't us." The screen lit up, showing IP logs, exchanged messages, and bank transfers. "It was you," Sophie said, pointing directly at Linda and Harold. "You created the fake evidence, planted the documents, and tried to frame us." The room burst into shocked murmurs. Linda turned pale. This is nonsense." "Nonsense?" Robert replied, pulling up more evidence. "Here are your messages planning everything. Here are the transfers to offshore accounts. And here," he paused for effect, "is the full confession recorded on the company's server." Harold tried to stand, but security was already on the way. Gregory slammed his hand on the table. "Security, escort Miss Foster and Mr. Bennett out immediately." The cameras captured everything. Linda and Harold were taken away under a storm of flashing lights and shouting journalists. Stratton Technology was saved once again. Later that day after work, Sophie and Robert met at a small, quiet bar in downtown New York. They ordered beers and sat in a quiet corner. "We did it," Sophie said, raising her glass. Robert clinked his with hers. "We did." They drank in silence for a few minutes, taking it all in. "You know," Robert said, looking at her, "you get on my nerves." Sophie laughed. "I know. You get on mine too," he smiled, "but you make me want to be better, fairer, more human." Sophie looked at him, touched. "That was almost a compliment, Robert King." "It was a compliment," he corrected, "and you should enjoy it because I'm not saying it again." She laughed out loud. All right, I'll take it." They stayed there for hours, talking, laughing, teasing each other, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt light. When they left the bar, the moon was shining over the New York sky. "Good night, Sophie," Robert said. "Good night, Robert." But before they parted ways, he held her hand for a brief moment. "Thank you. For everything." She smiled. "You're welcome." The next morning, Gregory Palmer called Sophie in for a private meeting. She walked into his office, curious. "Miss Hayes, please have a seat." She sat down. Gregory took a deep breath. "The board voted, and we've decided you should be officially named CEO of Straight-On Industries." Sophie's eyes widened. "What? You've saved this company twice. You have vision, leadership, and courage. You're the right choice." Sophie was speechless. "What about Robert?" "He'll stay on as executive vice president, but the leadership is yours." She swallowed hard. "I accept." Gregory smiled. "Good. We'll announce it tomorrow." As Sophie walked out of the office, her heart was racing. She knew Robert wouldn't take it well, and she was right. When the news reached him, Robert King's ego went into full crisis. The next day, Sophie Hayes officially became CEO of Straight-On Industries. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Gregory Palmer made the announcement in front of the board, employees, and the press gathered in the main auditorium. "It is with great pride that I present our new CEO, Sophie Hayes, the woman who transformed this company and proved that talent knows no limits." Applause filled the room. Sophie stepped up to the stage, wearing a sleek gray suit, but keeping the same simple, genuine smile that defined her. "Thank you," she said into the microphone. "I promise to do my best, and if I make mistakes, you can count on me to own them and fix them. After all, I used to be a janitor. I know how to clean up messes." Laughter spread warmly across the room. From the back, Robert watched with his arms crossed. He clapped politely, but the forced smile didn't fool anyone. After the ceremony, Sophie went straight to what used to be Robert's office, now, officially, hers. She stepped in slowly, taking in the spacious room, the glass desk, the panoramic view of New York. "Wow," she murmured. "Is this real?" There was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said, sitting down in the chair. Robert walked in, hands in his pockets, posture stiff. "Congratulations," he said without much emotion. "Thank you," Sophie replied, trying to read his expression. "Gregory told me I'll be your executive vice president." "I know, and I'm glad to have you on the team." Robert nodded but said nothing more. He just turned around and left. Sophie sighed. "This is going to be interesting." In the following days, meetings turned into scenes of unintentional comedy. Sophie tried to delegate tasks, explain strategies, and lead discussions. Robert, on the other hand, still tried to take control by habit. "We're going to implement the new sales system," Sophie announced in a morning meeting. Robert stood up. "Actually, I think we should review the contracts first." Sophie looked at him, amused. "Robert, you're the VP now. I'm the CEO, remember?" He opened his mouth to reply, but employees were already chuckling quietly. "Oh, right. Of course," he said, sitting back down, clearly embarrassed. At another meeting, Sophie asked for ideas about a new project. "Anyone have suggestions?" Robert raised his hand right away. "I suggest that." "Robert," Sophie interrupted with a smile, "you don't have to raise your hand, you can just speak." He lowered his hand, blushing. "Oh, right." The staff could barely hold back their laughter. Even so, despite the early tension, the company was thriving like never before. Profits soared, productivity reached record levels, employees were more motivated, more creative, and happier. And the press loved the story. Headlines were everywhere. The former janitor who became CEO and saved a multi-million-dollar company. Sophie Hayes, the woman behind the revolutionary I. From invisible to unforgettable. The journey of Sophie Hayes. Sophie was invited to international events, tech conferences, and TV interviews. She accepted a few, always keeping her trademark humility and humor. In one interview, the host asked, "How does it feel to be called an inspiration?" Sophie laughed. "I feel normal. I just did what I thought was right, and honestly, I'm still learning. Every day brings a surprise." The audience loved her. Meanwhile, Robert was struggling inside. He was trying to adjust to the new role, but it wasn't easy. His ego had been built over years of being in charge, and now he had to take orders. But something else was happening. He started to miss the arguments with Sophie. He missed the heated debates, the teasing, the challenging stares. He missed her. One evening, during a gala dinner held to celebrate Straton's success, Robert drank more than he should have. Sophie was on the other side of the room, talking with investors, laughing, glowing. He walked over, slightly unsteady. "Sophie?" She turned, surprised. "Robert, are you okay?" "I'm great," he said with a crooked smile. "Actually, no, I'm terrible." She excused herself from the investors and guided Robert to a quieter corner. "What's going on?" Robert looked at her, his eyes full of a mix of alcohol and emotion. "You know what I miss?" "What?" "When you used to yell at me, when you challenged me, when we argued all the time." Sophie chuckled, touched. "You're drunk." "I am," he admitted, "but I'm telling the truth. I miss you, the version of you that wasn't afraid to push back." She looked into his eyes. "I'm still that person, Robert, but now I'm your boss." He gave a sad smile. "I know, and maybe that's why I'm so confused." Sophie sighed. "Let's get you home." She called a driver and made sure Robert got back safely to his apartment. When she returned to the dinner, she was deep in thought. Then, Gregory Palmer pulled her aside, his face serious. "Sophie, we need to talk." "What is it?" Gregory handed her a tablet. "We just got a call from William Hayes, our biggest investor. He's threatening to pull all his funding from the company." Sophie's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "He wants Stratton to launch a new, revolutionary technology in 5 days. If not, he'll leave and take half the other investors with him." Sophie felt the floor drop beneath her feet. 5 days? That's impossible." "I know," Gregory said, worried. "But if he pulls out, we lose more than $200 million. The company might not survive." Sophie took a deep breath, trying to think. What kind of technology does he want? A full update to the AI software. He wants something no competitor has, something unique. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, taking it in. 5 days, she repeated. "Can you do it?" Gregory asked. She opened her eyes, determined. "I'm going to need help, and I'm going to need Robert with me, all in." Gregory nodded. "Then make it happen." Sophie left the dinner with her mind racing. 5 days to create something revolutionary. 5 days to save the company again. And this time she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed Robert, his talent, his experience, their partnership. The next day, she knocked on his office door. "Come in," he said, sounding tired. Sophie walked in and got straight to the point. "We need to talk. We've got a huge problem, and I need you." Robert looked up, surprised. "What are you talking about?" She told him everything, the investor's ultimatum, the impossible deadline, the risk of bankruptcy. When she finished, Robert was already on his feet, eyes shining with that old determination. 5 days? 5 days. He held out his hand. "Let's do it. Together." Sophie shook his hand, feeling the strength of their partnership return. Together. And in that moment, they both knew the real battle was just beginning. The next morning, Sophie and Robert turned the main office into a war room. Desks were rearranged, computers hooked up. Whiteboards filled with diagrams, code, and ideas scribbled in black marker. The IT team was called in. Everyone understood what was at stake. 5 days to build something revolutionary, or the company would sink. Sophie stood in front of the team, explaining the plan. "We need an algorithm that learns on its own, adapts to different scenarios, and runs faster than anything else out there." Robert, standing beside her, crossed his arms. "That's going to require serious testing. We can't just launch it without going through safety protocols." Sophie looked at him. "Robert, we've got 5 days. We don't have time for every protocol." "And what if something goes wrong?" He pushed back. "If the system fails during the presentation, we lose everything." "And if we don't try, we lose it anyway," she answered firmly. The team exchanged glances. The pattern was familiar. They were arguing again. Robert took a deep breath. "All right, but we do it my way on the critical parts." "And my way on the creative ones," Sophie countered. He held out his hand. Deal. She shook it. Deal. Hours turned into days. The office became their second home. Sophie and Robert slept on makeshift couches, surrounded by laptops, cables, and stacks of coffee cups. On the second night, around 3 a.m, Sophie was typing furiously while Robert reviewed code beside her. "This won't work," he said, pointing to a line of code. "Yes, it will," Sophie replied without looking up. "No, it won't. The structure's wrong." Sophie stopped typing and looked at him. "Robert, I created the original software. I know what I'm doing. And I've got 20 years of experience managing systems," he said, just as stubborn. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Sophie sighed and deleted the line. "Fine, do it your way." Robert blinked, surprised. "Really?" "Really, but if it doesn't work, I'll be saying, 'I told you so' for the rest of your life." He gave a small smile. "Fair enough." A few minutes later, his code worked perfectly. Sophie rolled her eyes. "All right, you were right. This time." "I'm always right," he teased. "Don't push it." Despite the arguments, something was different in the air. A connection. A kind of romantic tension that neither of them dared to name. When their eyes met, there was a spark. Something beyond work. On the third day, Sophie noticed Robert was exhausted. He kept rubbing his eyes, his posture was tense, and he'd snapped 3 times in just 1 hour. "Let's get out of here," she said suddenly. Robert looked up, confused. "What?" "Let's go. Out of the office. Now." "Sophie, we don't have time to." "Exactly," she cut in, standing up. "If we keep going like this, we're going to burn out. Let's take a walk. Just 20 minutes. He hesitated, but she was already grabbing her coat. "Come on, Robert. CEO's orders." He sighed, but got up. They left the building and walked to a small nearby park. The cool afternoon air hit Robert's face, and he took a deep breath. "I admit," he said, walking beside her, "this is nice." "I know," Sophie replied with a smile. "Sometimes the best solution is to stop looking for one." They walked in silence for a few minutes, watching people, birds, and life all around them. Then Sophie stopped in front of an ice cream cart. "Do you like ice cream?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "Answer the question." "Yes, I do." "Then let's go. My treat." They bought ice cream. Sophie chose vanilla, Robert picked chocolate, and sat on a bench. "When was the last time you did this?" Sophie asked, licking her ice cream. Robert thought for a moment. "I don't remember." "Exactly. You work so much you forgot how to live." He looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe you're right." Sophie smiled. "I'm always right." Robert laughed, a real genuine laugh that even surprised him. Sophie looked at him, charmed. "Wow, you actually laughed. I thought you didn't know how." "I know how to do many things," he replied, still smiling. "Then you should do them more often." They went back to the office feeling lighter, more focused. And over the next few hours, the work flowed better than ever. On the 5th day, right before the presentation, they finally finished. The new algorithm was ready. It was elegant, fast, smart, everything William Hayes had asked for. Sophie and Robert tested the system several times. Everything worked perfectly. "We did it," said Sophie, exhausted but happy. Robert nodded, relieved. "Yes, we did." They exchanged a look full of pride and gratitude. But then, the day of the presentation arrived. The conference room was packed. Investors, journalists, board members, executives from other companies. Everyone wanted to see the new technology from Touching Industries. William Hayes sat in the front row, arms crossed, wearing a critical expression. Gregory Palmer opened the presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that we the next generation of artificial intelligence software from Touching Industries." Sophie stepped onto the stage, followed by Robert. She connected the laptop to the projector and launched the system. The screen lit up. The algorithm began to run, and then suddenly the screen froze. Sophie blinked, confused. "What?" She clicked again. Nothing. The system was frozen. Murmurs spread across the room. William Hayes frowned. Robert turned pale beside Sophie, completely frozen himself. Panic started to creep in. But then, Sophie took a deep breath and raised her hands to ask for silence. "Everyone, please, stay calm." She looked at Robert. "Do you trust me?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I trust you." Sophie turned to the audience. "I'm going to rewrite the code live. You'll get to see exactly how the system works." She pulled over a chair, sat in front of the laptop, and started typing. Lines of code appeared on the screen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. The room fell completely silent, watching. Robert stayed beside her, tense but confident. Minutes passed. The code grew on the screen. And finally, Sophie pressed enter. The screen flickered. The system came back online. And this time, it ran perfectly. The audience burst into applause. The applause echoed throughout the conference room. Sophie stood up from the chair, her heart still racing, and looked out at the crowd. Everyone was on their feet, applauding enthusiastically. Robert stood beside her, clearly relieved, with a smile she rarely saw. William Hayes, the investor, stood up too. He walked to the stage and shook Sophie's hand. "Miss Hayes, that was impressive. I've never seen anyone reprogram a system live like that." Sophie smiled, still catching her breath. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. It was intense." "Intense but brilliant," he replied. "I'd like to see the full results now." Robert took over, showing the graphs on the screen. The new algorithm not only fixed the issue, but it also increased efficiency by 42% compared to the previous version. It processes data in real time, learns from every interaction, and adapts to complex scenarios automatically. The room went silent, taking in the information. William Hayes nodded, clearly impressed. 42%? That's groundbreaking. "It is," Sophie agreed. "And there's still room for improvement. This is just the beginning." William looked at Gregory Palmer, who was seated in the front row. "Mr. Palmer, I'm pleased, very pleased. Not only will I keep my investment, I want to double it. Straton Technology just proved it's leading the future of innovation." The room exploded in applause again. Gregory stood up, smiling. "Mr. Hayes, it's an honor to continue this partnership." Journalists began asking questions. Cameras captured every moment. Sophie and Robert answered together, switching between technical explanations and strategic vision. The chemistry between them was clear. They complemented each other perfectly. When the presentation ended, the board arranged an impromptu press conference in the main lobby. The press conference was intense. Reporters from every news outlet were there. Microphones raised, cameras recording. Gregory Palmer opened the conference. "Today, Straton Technology proved that innovation and courage go hand in hand. And we owe it all to two exceptional people. Our CEO, Sophie Hayes, and our Executive Vice President, Robert King." Flashes went off. A journalist raised his hand. "Miss Hayes, how do you feel about being called the former janitor who revolutionized technology?" Sophie laughed. "I feel grateful, and honestly, a little surprised. But I think this just proves that talent can come from anywhere. You don't need a fancy title to have important ideas." Another journalist asked, "Mr. King, what's it like working alongside Miss Hayes?" Robert hesitated for a moment, then looked straight into the cameras. "I'll be honest. At first it was hard. I underestimated Sophie. I thought I knew everything. But she proved me wrong. And today I can say without a doubt, without her, neither I nor this company would still exist." The room fell silent. Sophie looked at him, clearly moved. Then she turned to the cameras and said with a playful smile, "See? Even a former janitor can teach a millionaire something." The room burst into laughter. The journalists loved it. The headlines were already writing themselves before the press conference even ended. When it was over, Sophie and Robert left the building together. "Did you mean it?" she asked as they walked down the sidewalk. "Mean what?" "What you said, that I saved you and the company." Robert stopped and looked at her. "I meant every word." Sophie smiled. "Thank you, that means a lot." They stood there on the sidewalk, looking at each other. And for the first time, the silence between them wasn't tense, it was full of understanding. Later that night, Robert planned a surprise. He called Sophie and asked her to come to his apartment. "Why?" she asked, curious. "Just come. Trust me." When Sophie arrived, she found the table set with candles, flowers, and a simple homemade meal, carefully prepared. "You cooked?" she asked, surprised. "I tried," Robert said, laughing. "Can't promise it's good, but I tried." Sophie sat at the table, touched by the gesture. They ate, talked, and laughed. The conversation flowed easily. No walls, no pretending. "I just wanted to say thank you," Robert said after a while, "for everything. For not giving up on me. For saving me. For making me want to be better." Sophie reached for his hand on the table. "You don't need to thank me, Robert. We did it together." He looked at her, eyes shining with emotion. "Sophie, I want to ask you something." Her heart started to race. "What?" Robert stood up, pulled something from his pocket, and got down on one knee beside her. Sophie's eyes widened. "Robert?" He opened a small velvet box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring. Sophie Hayes, you changed my life. You taught me how to listen, how to trust, how to love, and I don't want to spend a single day without you by my side. Will you marry me? Sophie was speechless, tears filling her eyes. But before she could answer, Robert's phone rang. He looked at the screen, frustrated. It's Gregory. Answer it, Sophie said, wiping her tears. It might be important. Robert answered the call, still kneeling. Hello? Robert, sorry to bother you, but it's urgent, Gregory said on the other end. I need you and Sophie at the board meeting tomorrow morning. First thing. Did something happen? I can't say right now, but it's important. You both need to be there. Robert hung up, looking confused. Sophie looked at him concerned. What is it? Gregory wants us at the board meeting first thing tomorrow. He said it's urgent. Sophie took a deep breath. All right, we'll be there. Robert put the ring box back in his pocket, clearly disappointed. Sorry, I wanted this moment to be perfect. Sophie cupped his face in her hands. This moment already is perfect. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and lingering. When they pulled back, Robert smiled. So, is that a yes? Sophie laughed, still teary-eyed. Ask me properly first. Will you marry me? Yes, she replied, smiling. 1,000 times yes. Robert hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, knowing that together they could face anything. Even whatever it was that Gregory Palmer had to say in the morning. The next morning, Sophie and Robert arrived early at the Stratton Technology Building. The board was already gathered when they walked in. Gregory was at the head of the table, his expression serious, but not worried. Have a seat, he said. They sat down side by side. What happened? Sophie asked. Gregory smiled. Nothing bad, actually something very good. He opened a folder and slid a document toward them. The board voted, and we've decided that the two of you should become the permanent co-CEOs of Stratton Industries. Sophie and Robert looked at each other, stunned. Co-CEOs? Robert repeated. Yes, Gregory confirmed. You've proven that together. You're unstoppable, and we want you to lead this company together, officially. Sophie held Robert's hand under the table. We accept, she said. Robert nodded. We accept. And at that moment, everything made sense. The journey that began with an invisible janitor and an arrogant CEO was now ending in a perfect partnership. Together they had saved the company, and now, together, they would lead it into the future. The board was still gathered when Gregory Palmer stood up again. There's one more thing, he said, smiling. Before we wrap up, I'd like to invite all employees to join us here. Sophie and Robert exchanged confused looks. Within minutes, the boardroom was full. Employees from every department walked in, curious and excited. Gregory waited for everyone to settle before continuing. As you all know, Sophie Hayes and Robert King have just been named the permanent co-CEOs of this company. But what you don't know is that their partnership goes beyond business. Sophie felt her heart race. Robert stood slowly, looking at her with a nervous smile. Sophie, he said, his voice slightly shaky. Last night I tried to ask you something, but we were interrupted. He got down on one knee, right there in front of everyone. The room fell completely silent. Sophie covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes already filled with tears. Robert pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Sophie Hayes, you changed my life. You taught me how to listen, how to trust, how to love for real. You're the most brilliant, courageous, and amazing person I've ever met. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you. So here, in front of everyone who's witnessed our journey, I ask, will you marry me? Sophie couldn't speak. She just nodded, laughing through her tears. Is that a yes? Robert teased, smiling. Yes, she exclaimed at last. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The room exploded with applause, cheers, and whistles. Robert placed the ring on her finger and pulled her into an emotional kiss. When they pulled apart, Sophie looked around at all the happy faces and laughed. You couldn't have picked a more private spot. I wanted everyone to know, Robert replied, that the janitor won over the CEO. She rolled her eyes, smiling. Actually, I think it was the other way around. Months later, the big day arrived. The ceremony was held in the garden of Stratton Industries, a large green space behind the building, completely transformed for the occasion. Bright lights hung from the trees, creating an artificial, starry sky. And in a symbolic touch that made everyone smile, tiny decorative computers were placed among the flowers, representing the heart of the company and their love story. White chairs were set up in neat rows filled with employees, friends, family, and even a few reporters who had followed the couple's journey. Sophie was in a makeshift dressing room, adjusting the simple white lace dress she had chosen. The door opened, and Gregory Palmer walked in, smiling. "Ready?" Sophie took a deep breath. "I think so. Almost." Gregory offered his arm. "Let's go. The groom is waiting." When the music started, Sophie walked down the flower-lined aisle, holding Gregory's arm. Robert stood at the altar, wearing a sharp gray suit, his eyes lighting up as he watched her approach. When she reached him, he took her hands and whispered, "You look beautiful." "So do you," she replied with a smile. The officiant began the ceremony, but before the traditional vows, he asked the couple to share a few words. Sophie went first. She looked out at the crowd and began. "When I was a janitor, invisible to most people, I learned something important. Never underestimate someone who seems small. Because greatness isn't about your job title, it's about what you do with the opportunities you're given. Robert gave me a chance, and I used it to change my life. And his." She looked at Robert, her eyes full of love. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Robert squeezed her hands and began his vows. "I spent my whole life thinking success was about control, power, money. But Sophie taught me real success is learning to listen. It's about trust, about loving without fear. She made me a better man, and for that, I'll be forever grateful." The guests were moved. Some wiped away tears quietly. When the vows were finished and the rings exchanged, the officiant smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Robert pulled Sophie into a long, passionate kiss as the crowd rose in a standing ovation. The reception was simple but full of joy. Music, food, laughter. Employees danced, toasted, celebrated. Sophie and Robert made their way through the guests, thanking them, chatting, enjoying every moment. At one point during the evening, Gregory Palmer asked to say a few words. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, raising his glass. "To Sophie and Robert, two exceptional leaders, two incredible people. And above all, two souls who found each other in the most unlikely place and changed not only their lives but all of ours. To straighten industries, and to love that triumphs." Everyone raised their glasses. To love. Later, as the party began to wind down, Sophie and Robert walked to the center of the garden for the couple's dance. The soft music started to play. He pulled her close, and they danced under the sparkling lights. "You know," Sophie whispered, resting her head on his shoulder, "I never imagined my life would turn out like this." "Me neither," Robert replied with a smile. "But I wouldn't change a thing." She leaned back slightly to look into his eyes. "See, Mr. Millionaire, the janitor won," Robert laughed, pulling her close again. "And thank goodness she did. Without you, I'd be lost." They kept dancing, lost in each other, as the lights around them seemed to shine even brighter. The months that followed were full of growth. Straton Technology thrived like never before. New contracts, new projects, new markets. The AI software Sophie created was licensed to companies all over the world, generating millions in revenue. And the story of Sophie and Robert became a symbol of perseverance, love, and teamwork. Newspapers ran features. TV shows made documentaries. Universities used their journey as a case study. But for them, fame and money weren't what mattered most. It was the partnership. Every morning, they arrived at the office together. Every afternoon, they discussed ideas, solved problems, made decisions. And every evening, they went home, laughing, talking, living. Years later, Sophie was sitting in the office reviewing reports when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," she said. Robert walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Sophie smiled. "Always." He sat beside her, and for a moment they sat in silence, looking out the window at the city below. "You know," Robert said, breaking the silence, "sometimes I still can't believe all of this really happened." "Me neither," Sophie agreed. "But it did, and it was real." Robert took her hand. "Thank you. For everything." Sophie squeezed his hand in return. "Thank you." And as the sun set over New York City, Sophie Hayes and Robert King stayed there, side by side. 2 leaders, 2 lovers, 2 souls who met in the most unlikely place and built something extraordinary. What did you think of Sophie and Robert's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the end screen.